Well, good afternoon. I'm Scott Rigell of Virginia, and on behalf of my colleagues, Representatives Elijah Cummings of Maryland, Carolyn Maloney of New York, and Pat Meehan of Pennsylvania, I want to thank you very much for being here today. We extend a special measure of appreciation for our law enforcement officials who are with us behind us here, including Chris Schottmeyer. He's the Vice President of the Federal Law Enforcement Officers Association. And we'll hear from Mr. Schottmeyer in just a few minutes. But first, all of us, the representatives, I'm sure all the folks who are here today, we really appreciate our law enforcement officials and keeping us safe. So thank you very much. We're here today as fellow members of Congress. Of course, we're here today as Republicans and Democrats. But we're first and foremost here today as fellow Americans. And we're here to introduce and advance a much needed piece of legislation, the Gun Trafficking Prevention Act of 2013. The Second Amendment serves as a high and an impassable wall that protects on one side every law-abiding American's constitutional right to own firearms. Now on the other side of that wall are those who do not have a constitutional right to firearms, namely criminals. Straw purchasers of firearms are those who lie when purchasing a firearm, saying it's for their own use when in fact their true intent is to get it to someone else. Now, this bill wisely tackles the deficiencies that exist right now in current federal law that make it difficult for our prosecutors and our law enforcement officials to deter and prosecute gun traffickers and straw purchasers. It really reflects the sound counsel and the advice of the good men and women behind us here, law enforcement prosecutors, those who are really on the front lines, and it reflects common sense and indeed common ground. We all surely recall the tragedy that occurred in New York. It unfolded on Christmas Eve when 2 Webster, New York firefighters were killed, and 2 more first responders were injured. When a man called the first responders to his home, he actually lit a fire, and when the first responders got there, he shot them. Now, where did he get the gun? Well, he couldn't legally purchase a gun because he was a convicted felon, so he found a straw purchaser. Look, we need to change the culture in America that says it's really no big deal to buy a gun for someone else. That's not a proper culture for our country. And as a lifetime member of the NRA, as a firearm owner, and as a father, and really as a grandfather, I've got a problem with people who break the law using firearms because it inevitably puts pressure on my rights. And I think when we punish the bad guys, we're protecting the good guys. And that's really the essence of this bill. Our law enforcement officers say it's really difficult to convict the bad guys because federal law on these two topics is disconnected. And, in fact, 4 out of 10 straw purchasers really suffer no meaningful consequence to what they just did. The legislation equips our law enforcement officers and prosecutors with what they don't have now and what they've said that they need. They're telling us they need a single section of federal code that gives them the authority and the guidance to prosecute gun traffickers and straw purchasers. Now, I've been asked to just cover a couple of the highlights of the bill. I'll do so here. The bill prohibits the purchase of firearms if the intent is to deliver it to someone else who is prohibited by federal or state law from possessing one. It strengthens penalties of raising them to up to 20 years imprisonment for straw purchasers. It increases the penalties for organizers or managers of firearms trafficking networks. And this is an essential step. It recommends to the Sentencing Commission that it increase penalties for multiple illegal gun purchasers. There's more to the bill. There's more to be said about the bill. And when all the members here have made just a few remarks and we hear from Mr. Schottmeyer, we'll be happy to answer any questions you might have. Thank you again. Really appreciate you being here today.